So there are some overlaps between this session and the previous one on emerging units, but we hope that this will be a kind of practical guide to establishing some behavioural insight principles in practice in government at various different levels. This is partly as a result of the fact that there are now, as you all know, many nudge units, behavioural insight teams, behavioural insight units around the world. I compiled this chart of many of them. It's not comprehensive. So if you feel that you yourself are in a unit that is not on this list, come and see me afterwards and I'll add you on. We're going to go through 3 different case studies today. I'm going to talk about the United Kingdom. I'm the managing director of the Behavioural Insights team, so I'm going to tell you a bit about the sort of story that we went through a framework that I'll introduce in a couple of minutes' time. As you probably know, at the Behavioural Insights team, we love our frameworks, but you'll be pleased to know it's not a mnemonic, so don't worry about that. I'm then going to introduce Ping Soon, who's going to talk about Singapore, who have taken behavioural insights to a very advanced level across the Singaporean government. So Ping Soon is going to give us a couple of examples of some of the practical applications of behavioural insights in Singapore. And then I'm going to hand over to Elspeth Kirkman, who is the head of the Behavioural Insights team's North American office. And Elspeth works across US cities with a big program of work with Bloomberg Philanthropies. So you should be able to get lots of different insights from different layers of government. But all of them have gone through, we think, the same similar trajectory that we think that we can all learn from. And in some ways, it was the path that when we were creating the Behavioural Insights team back in 2010, we started to think about putting into practice without really knowing whether or not it might work. And so there are 4 parts to this very, very simple framework. The first is all about getting buy-in from your partners. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we mean by partners and how it's not just about political support that's important there. The second, which is a theme that I think has come through many different sessions over the past couple of days, which is starting with the quick wins and why this is really, really important to being able to then move to more complex policy areas. And we think that sometimes this is almost the most important lesson that is often forgotten about, because behavioural insights has always been quite a new discipline. And if you're able to say, here is something that we can demonstrably say works, then you can start moving on to more complex areas. And then the 4th and final thing is the importance of building your capability. So building the capability of both your team, but also being quite open to working with others, to building partnerships and to helping others to develop their own capability. So that trajectory is the one that I'm going to talk through from a UK case study perspective. Ping Soon's going to do something similar in relation to Singapore, and then Elspeth's going to do something very similar in relation to US cities. So case study number 1, the United Kingdom. So this first lesson is, it is almost impossible to get a team up and running if you don't have backing from the people that you need in order to get programs and projects in place. And I think in the UK context, there are some individuals that we almost always focus upon as part of this process. So the Prime Minister was obviously critical in helping to lay the foundations for the creation of the Behavioural Insights team back in 2010. But just as important were what we describe as the administrative support that is often not recognised. So these 2 people here, this is in the middle there is Lord Gus O'Donnell, who used to be the head of the UK Civil Service. He's now no longer a civil servant, but he continues as the chair of our academic advisory panel. And on the right-hand side is Sir Jeremy Hayward, who is the new head of the UK Civil Service. Both of those people, in addition to the Prime Minister, were very, very strong supporters of behavioural insight approaches as alternatives to a more regulatory-driven approach to getting stuff to happen in a UK government context. And they're kind of often forgotten about in the context of creating and sustaining a unit. But my real behavioural insight hero are not any of these 3 characters. They are people like this guy. This is Nick Down, who was the head of a unit in HMRC called Debt Management and Banking. And this person I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. but he is in many ways critical in the life cycle of the behavioral insight team. And it's partly as a result of the fact that if you really want to make something happen within a behavioral insight context, you need to find people who are operational leaders whose aim is to make things happen. And you can have all of the political support that you want, but without individuals on the ground who are willing to take things down a different path, it is very difficult to make anything happen. And my one bit of advice would be to say, find your Nick Downs wherever you are, whatever administration you're working in, because they're the people who will be able to create the next stage of things, which is the quick wins. And I'm going to describe in a minute what I mean by the kind of characteristics of these quick wins. But in what is now probably the most famous example of the behavioral insights team's work, which is being around tax compliance, it was really Nick Down in the tax administration, the tax authority in the UK, who spotted this initial opportunity. He'd read Robert Cialdini's work around social influence and was interested in how it could be applied in a UK government context. We spied that opportunity and we seconded people from our unit into the tax authority in order to work with Nick to start running these trials. And as you probably know, it's almost like I feel that this one example is now so often quoted, it's become a cliche that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. But if it wasn't for individuals like Nick, we would have never run these experiments. Similarly, we had developed some partnerships with people in the court service in the UK. And it kind of exemplified another aspect of our early approach, which is unless you really understand the operational side of practice, you won't be able to see where the opportunities are for putting in practice projects and running trials. And in this particular case, we noticed that there was a guy in the court service who was texting people who'd failed to pay their fines. And at the same time, when we went out with bailiffs, we noticed that people just weren't opening final reminder letters. So there was an opportunity to work within the operational side of the court service to run trials. And again, this is a sort of fairly famous early example of ours. We noticed that texting people, prompting them to pay their court fines on time, more than doubled the response rates, and personal messages that were aimed at an individual seemed to be even more effective. And similarly, I could tell this story about maybe 50 different areas. We work with the Department for Energy and Climate Change at the moment at which they were changing the labelling for energy performance certificates, which every house that's being sold in the UK needs to display. These are the old certificates, very similar to the car labelling example that's been used a few times here, almost impossible for anybody to understand. I remember when we were doing this work now, 4 or 5 years ago, asking that question, could anybody actually explain these labels to me in sort of lay-person terms? And the answer seemed to be an emphatic no. They tell you that you can go from a 37 to a 73 on the energy efficiency rating front, but if you look at the environmental impact in terms of carbon dioxide, you could go from a 31 to a 69. So we changed it to this, which just tells you how much it will cost to heat and light your home over a 3-year period and how much you could save if you take 3 simple actions. So what are the kind of features of a quick win? Well, we think that, and just going back to my earlier point, that the purpose of the quick win is to be able to demonstrate in the early days of creating a unit that you can put something into practice relatively simply, that you can demonstrate an effect, and that will then take you on to more complex areas. And there are a few lessons, right? So you're already doing something. You're already sending out letters. You're already trying to collect your fines. The second is that you're already measuring the outcomes. You don't need to put in place lots of new complex outcome measures that you have to then create new monitoring systems to see whether or not they're likely to be effective. The third is that you can vary the interventions in some ways. If you're sending out 200,000 tax letters, the real question is, can you vary the way in which you do so by changing some of the letters and not changing the others? And then ideally, you've also got a large sample of people as well. Are you talking about a system in which you're sending out 10 letters to 10 people across the country, or are you talking about a system where 200, 300,000 people are involved? And then the last lesson is that you get the results back reasonably quickly, right? So for it to be a quick win, it's no good to be in a situation where you're saying, we'll put this in place and in 3 years' time, we will get the results. But what these quick wins enable you to do is to build the case for those areas that are more complex and will take a lot more time. And it was only after 18 months or so that we started to move into some of these more complex areas. So this is a job centre in Essex, in a place called Loughton. In fact, Elspeth herself did a lot of trips to this particular job centre. We were asked to work on this program, which was around helping to get people back into work more quickly. It would have been, I think, for the Behavioural Insights team in its early days, fairly suicidal to start with this project, because you're talking about very, very complex interventions that will take many, many months, if not years, to reveal their results. But once you have a tranche of interesting findings, people will start to come to you and say, actually, I've got this problem that is quite complicated that you will need to invest more time and effort into putting into practice. So we spent time working in this particular job centre in order to design interventions, and a lot of them were exemplifiers of the kind of approach that we had then, by this point, started to detail. So it was all around simplification of processes, getting people to commit to future activities rather than dwelling upon what happened in the past. So we'd now run, we turned this into a big trial to demonstrate the effectiveness of these kinds of interventions in a job searching context. And in fact, a lot of this work has also been demonstrated to be quite effective in Australia and Singapore. And there are lots of trials, including those that David talked about this morning, that show that once you've got some of your quick wins, you can start trialing things in much more complex environments. The other thing is that it started to create those quick wins demand in lots of interesting new areas that wouldn't necessarily be seen initially as sort of classic behavioural insight type interventions. So this is one of my favourite examples. We work with the Home Office and the Metropolitan Police, the police force for London, who are worried about the rates of mobile phone theft. 750,000 mobile phones get stolen every year in the UK. We realised that it was going to be quite difficult to influence consumer behaviour in this area. So we developed, borrowing from some work that had been done in the 1980s around car thefts, what we call this mobile phone theft ratio, which is using the data that the Metropolitan Police gather to construct these charts that show you which mobile phones in London are the most targeted. And we do that by looking at which phones are stolen in context in which they could have been known to be a particular brand of phone, as opposed to situations where somebody's had their bag snatched and you wouldn't have known what kind of make of mobile phone was in it. And for the first time this year, we're finding that Apple phones do not dominate the top of the list. So the most targeted phone in London at the moment is the HTC M8. And the point of this is that the manufacturers hold the key to reducing mobile phone thefts. And we can see in the data the effect of new security measures on mobile phone handsets when they come in, and what the effect is on theft rates. And it allows you as well to start thinking about much bigger, more strategic policy questions. Again, I'm not going to go into this in any detail. David talked about this a lot this morning. But it enables you to publish reports like this. This is one that we published a couple of weeks ago. I think it's really, really fascinating and could lead to a whole new program of work for us in the future. It's around a kind of new vision for how you might regulate consumer markets in the future if you applied an explicitly behavioural lens. So it will encourage you all to read that. But the point of this is to just say, having those quick wins in the early days gives you license to move on to these bigger, more strategic, more complex areas. But none of that is possible if you don't think about how you build capability. And so I think one of the things that certainly I have spent a lot of the past 4 or 5 years thinking about is things like what kind of team do you want to recruit and put in place? So one lesson that I think has come through many of the sessions that I've seen over the past couple of days has been that you need to have a good blend of people from different specialisms. So it's not just about getting a first-rate academic behavioral scientist and putting them into a government department. It's about thinking at the team level rather than the individual. And the three sets of skills that we always try to blend within a project team are people who've got policy skills. So people who understand the systems of the governments and the processes that they are looking at. People who have very, very advanced behavioral science knowledge and skills, who can spot the opportunity, who can then work with the person who understands the system in order to put something in place. And then people who have trial design experience as well. And there is the possibility, obviously, that someone has all of those skills, but I think we have found very, very few people who can combine all three of those things in one person. So thinking at the team level is the first thing. The second is methods are really important. And from an early stage, we started to put quite a lot of emphasis upon our methodologies. So we developed a series of project management tools that exemplify how we think you should run a behavioral insights type project. And that links to what we would call thought leadership. So interestingly, this paper that we wrote 3 or 4 years ago, Test, Learn, Adapt, we were amazed to find it was the most downloaded policy paper for the Cabinet Office that year. Who'd have thought that a paper on running randomized evaluations might become popular for the policy-making community, and frameworks around how to develop solutions. But I think number one important thing for us is around that strong focus on training and helping others. And that partly explains why the UK government has not seen the development of the Behavioural Insights team as something which somehow usurps what they might be doing themselves, but alongside the growth of BIT has been the growth of units within pretty much every government department. And I think similar things are starting to happen in Singapore and in Australia and elsewhere as well. So I'm going to just finish by telling you a little bit about what's happening across the rest of the UK government, because it is in some ways like many quite interesting to see how the UK government has expanded its interest in this area. So there are lots of units, dedicated units that now have reasonable headcounts. In areas like tax compliance, HMRC said to me they weren't sure whether they had 35 people or 13 people who were behavioural insights specialists. It depends on your definition. Our Department for Work and Pensions, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Ministry of Justice, they all have dedicated units, and some of them are reasonably large. But just as prevalent is a model which is a small capacity of 1, 2, 3 people who are managing networks across their departments. So again, I was quite surprised that our National Audit Office, which is like the kind of policeman for government, has a couple of full-time equivalent people, but a practitioner group of 60 across the whole of the NAO. And similarly, we have several departments who don't have dedicated capacity or units, but they are now running fairly major programs and projects of their own. So it might be the Foreign Office work on countering corruption. We've got an event tomorrow on that, or the Treasury's new interest in things like long-termism and pensions. But I go back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is that I think without that focus on building capacity, on gaining the support of others, and then in the early days, getting some quick wins under your belt, I don't think any of this would have happened in a UK context. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Ping Soon, who's from the Ministry of Manpower. And I think it would be fair to say that the Ministry of Manpower has done more than any other government department in Singapore to help embed behavioural insights. And Ping Soon is a very important man. He is he's also a very modest man. He's the Deputy Secretary in the Ministry of Manpower. He oversees their corporate services group, but more importantly for us all, that includes their behavioural design unit. So I'll hand over to Ping Soon, then to Elspeth, and then we'll do a bit of a discussion and Q&A.
Thank you, Owen. I'm delighted to join Owen and Elspeth on this panel to share some of the Singapore experience of our government agencies in behavioural insights. Actually, our relationship with BIT goes back to 2012, And in fact, we've recently renewed our third MOU with them, which will see us doing projects within the Ministry of Manpower, which is where I'm from, to national level projects with other government agencies. Now, having said that, I need that clicker, right? Yeah. Having said that, actually the applications of behavioral insights and behavioral economics are actually not very new in Singapore. As some of you all know, Singapore is a pretty small country. Just how small? About 700 square kilometers. That book are slightly smaller than New York City. Well, about 100 kilometers square smaller than New York City. And with about 1 million vehicles. So managing traffic in Singapore is a big issue. So in the 1970s, the policymakers wanted to see how they could reduce congestion in downtown. So we implemented the area licensing scheme. This is a scheme, where motorists will have to pay for a single charge, either on a monthly or daily rate basis, for the right to drive into the downtown. So you will definitely recognize this, right? It's a classic case of a sunk cost fallacy, right? So since you have already paid for it, why constrain the use of your car? So the policymakers then wanted to find out whether there's another better method, to increase the salience of the cost of driving to congested area. So in 1998, which is almost 20 years ago, the government introduces the Electronic Road Pricing System, or ERP for short. The ERP charges the motorist on a pay-as-you-use basis as it crosses every gantry. So how it does is that you have a store value card in a vehicle, which will then be deducted every time you cross over a gantry. And so in 2008, this was further improved. What happened is that we have allowed the motorists to see the real-time charges that you have to pay in using a congested road. So that makes the actual cost, the saliency of the cost in terms of driving a congested road even more salient for motorists. So today, ERP is actually quite synonymous for driving in Singapore. And for the locals, the ERP doesn't stand for electronic road pricing. It stands for everyday road people. And that beep sound that you hear when the vehicle crosses the gantry is one of the most painful sounds that any Singaporean would want to hear. Of course, you will know that this picture is a hoax, right? There's no road in Singapore with so many ERP gantries on a short stretch. Maybe 2, but not 5 or 6, right? So the point here is that I think if we had been applying behavioral insights, in our policy design 20 years ago, so what's really new here, right? I think the behavioral insights has certainly kicked up a fervor in Singapore over the last 2 years. Partly is due to the great work done by many of the renowned behavioral scientists over here, but partly is also because of the sea change in terms of the policy-making environment in Singapore. In 2015, a study of our citizen satisfaction with the government shows that over a third of our respondents are dissatisfied with the way they interacted with the government, which is pretty startling for us. Citizens expect public services to be done in a way that is easy to use. Citizens expect services to be done or to be delivered in a way that's more empathetic and more personalized. And certainly, citizens demand that the services are being delivered in a very consistent and timely manner. Unfortunately, some of our programs did not meet the mark. Many of our communication materials are laden with official jargon and legalistic language. Our policies sometimes are crafted for that average Joe that only exists in the realm of the policymakers. And some of our services are being designed to almost guarantee that you need to have a human interaction. So set against these challenges, the application of BI in Singapore are focused on 3 broad areas. Number 1, how do we improve service delivery? How can we increase the customers' or citizens' satisfaction in dealing with the government and at the same time encourage them to do self-help? And 2, how do we increase the compliance and improve enforcement productivity? Essentially, how do we nudge our citizens to be a bit more law-abiding and for us to have less enforcement resources to do that? And third, how can we improve our program design? Specifically, how can we help people reach better life outcomes? Now, our agencies also did not start with a big bang. They begin with relatively simple BI projects, as what Owen said, the quick wins. And that's important, of course, to generate confidence as well as to win friends. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. The first is a project between the Behavioral Design Unit in the Ministry of Manpower, where I'm from, and the Central Provident Fund Board, or CPF. Just a quick plug, the CPF is actually our mandatory social security savings schemes, jointly funded in terms of contributions by the employers' employees. It is a key pillar in our social security system that serves to meet the Singaporeans' retirement needs, housing needs, and healthcare needs, among others. Now, we all know that when it comes to retirement planning, people generally do 3 things, right? Number 1, they generally discount the future, they underestimate their needs, and they fail to plan sufficiently ahead. So the CPF board recently introduced a pre-retirement planning service for those turning 55. This is a one-to-one 45-minute service with this young, pretty officer who will explain and guide you through the retirement options. And because it's a pilot, the CPF board sent out a letter like this to 1,000 Singaporeans to invite them to attend the service. So make a guess how many turn up for this, right? 150, even though it's free. So what do? So the BDU worked with the CPF board to simplify the letter, to increase the relevance by providing personalized information, and shifted the focus to pre-commit the recipients, to have them think about when should I go rather than should I go. We conducted a 4-arm RCT that tested the effectiveness of the various interventions, and the letter that pre-commits the participants was most effective, with about 32% taking up the service. The second example that I want to quote is one from the Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, their problem is how can I get Singaporeans to be more prepared for emergency by attending free emergency preparedness training conducted by the fire service. So they have all these services, training. So what do, right? Typically, they'll print leaflets indicating the schedule of the training and distribute it to the neighborhoods. As you can imagine, not many people turn up for that. So the fire service decided to reframe their invites, by highlighting the salience of the training. So the redesigned invites will focus, on telling them, what are the things that you can learn by attending the training that will help yourself, to protect your family, and to protect your neighbors. And just a simple change like that, over 70% of the respondents who received this invite expressed interest to attend the training, compared to about 43% from the control group. But what's more important is that 14% of those who expressed interest, who are being nudged to pre-commit to attend the training, actually turn up, compared to 1% of those who are not being nudged, who just given the schedule of training. So it's quite impressive for the fire service. My third example is one of the things that the Singaporeans hate to get, which is a parking ticket. And when Singaporeans receive a parking ticket, the most instinctive reaction they do is not to pay, it's to appeal. They'll appeal to the authorities to waive the parking ticket. So our problem is how do we actually discourage the unnecessary appeals against all these parking fines? Because many times the appeals are baseless, groundless, but it takes up a lot of our processing resources. So the Urban Redevelopment Authority, which actually manages the public car parks in Singapore, redesigned their online appeal service. The interface now provides salient information that most appeals were rejected and that most people paid their fines on time. And the option to proceed with payment was also provided with the same online service. This is an online service for you to appeal, but we also tell them, look, instead of appealing, you can just go ahead and click the button and pay for the fine. Simple interventions, right? And it actually reduced appeals by about 35%. I'm sorry, about 12%, or about 3,500 per year. So those three were the easy wins. And the interventions, as you can see, is relatively simple. A change in the letter, a change in the invite, a change in the website. But it was important in order to create confidence and win new friends. So with this, I think the confidence of the team increases, management support was there, and so we went on to do bigger projects. And I'm going to share 3 examples. First, how do we help disadvantaged households who have been receiving financial aid gain independence through work? We know from our survey that 25% or a quarter of these households actually have a work-capable person in the household, so they could actually get work. But a lot of times, these families are being caught in what I call a state of learned helplessness, and sometimes lack the motivation to be weaned off financial assistance. So the Ministry of Social and Family Development partnered the Public Service Division, actually designing and running a series of work trials along with a jobs workbook that support their job search process. This workbook is designed to ignite their intrinsic motivation to gain financial independence. But more importantly, the whole job search journey through this workbook is broken down into bite-sized tasks that then nudge them into action. And then this is further complemented by a series of automated text messages that are being sent to them regularly to commit them to the actions. The trials are currently underway, and we hope to have positive results to share in BX2017. Second, how can we get our residents to lead healthier lives? Now, based on WHO guidelines, 1 in 4 Singaporeans do not get sufficient physical activity, which I think you all know is a leading risk factor for obesity. And in fact, obesity has been increasing in Singapore. About 12% of our school children are obese, up from about 10% in 2012. So instead of simply exhorting our citizens to be healthy and do more exercise, the Health Promotion Board actually launched a National Steps Challenge. This is one of the posters that was being put up. Exercising is now made more attractive by giving respondents a smart wearable technology in the form of a wearable step tracker, as well as giving small incentives for walking 5,000 to 10,000 steps daily. And since launching it in October, about 156,000 people have signed up, way beyond the expectations. In fact, so many people signed up that we ran out of wearable step trackers to give out, so we got to hold them back a little bit. But what's more important is the data that has been tracked has shown that on average, people who used to walk 3,000 to 4,000 steps daily has now almost doubled that to about 8,500. Third, how might we get self-employed persons to make contributions to their CPF MediSave accounts to meet their future healthcare expenses? Now, today, the self-employed persons in Singapore constitute about 14% of our workforce, and this is set to grow due to the changing nature of work as well as the impact of technology. And despite outreach, through mailers and through roadshows, only about 80% of them regularly contribute to the MediSave accounts. And their MediSave balance is actually about a quarter less than those who are employees, so it's an issue for us. So currently, the team is studying the data and actually conducting interviews to better understand and profile the self-employed, which is actually quite a diverse group. So our hope is to be able to build an ecosystem and apply the behavioral insights that will facilitate voluntary contributions automatically. So those were the three big projects that we're working on. So what did we learn? Three quick lessons. First, as Owen has said, I think it's important for us to be deliberate, but also creative in terms of capability building. Owen talked a lot about the need to recruit the right people, and I fully agree with that. In the MOM, the selection of the officers to form the initial few that formed the behavioral design unit was quite critical. We selected officers who were highly passionate, who were very dogged, and also very connected in organizations. So we formed a team with, we think, quite a good mix of policy, operations, design, and behavioral sciences. And when we formed that, we invested in their development quite aggressively, as well as give them the leadership support needed to do the projects. But really, to truly institutionalize BI in any organization, you need more than this group of people, which I call the fire starters. We need to be able to set the organization ablaze, right, and get people to be excited with BI. But at the same time, you have to demystify it to make it more relatable and more applicable. So 2 years ago, to do that, we initiated a letter writing competition to transform the 1,000 over standard letters that the Ministry of Manpower issued to the citizens. Officers are encouraged to form small teams, to apply the BI principles to change the tonality of the letters, and prizes were given, to the best design letters. So we did that 2 years ago. And then to build on that momentum, we have recently introduced the behavioral design platform. This is an in-house design, 6 months, a learn and applied curriculum, where selected officers will be able to work on actual business challenges sponsored by a head of department. And then to further ingrain the essence of human centricity into the DNA of our organization, we have codified elements of behavioral insights into our new service excellence principles, which we call HEARTS, which is a set of 5 service values that all MOM officers are expected to apply in their work. So for us, HEART, as you can see over there, stands for hear them out, make it easy, anticipate their needs, respect every individual, and be timely. Second, I think it's important to seek to integrate BI with other tools. Now, the application of BI does not need to be limited or done in isolation of other policy-making tools. The field of design thinking, for example, is very complementary with BI, as both disciplines start on the basis of being human-centered. In fact, our journey on design thinking started way before behavioral insights. And at about the same time we set up the behavioral design unit, we have also set up a business analytics competency center to be able to learn and utilize advanced analytics methodologies to solve business problems. So we have now integrated and are in the process of integrating the business analytics into a whole suite of policy-making and sense-making tools so that we can make better decisions that are human-centered as well as data-driven. Finally, don't be shy to share and learn from one another, including those experiments that did not work out. In the Singapore government, we have set up a behavioral insights and design COP in 2014. Today, there are over 200 members from over 30 public agencies. And this community meets quarterly to discuss project ideas and results, to share best practices in building up capabilities, as well as to explore partnership. And in fact, I'm not here alone today. There's 14 other colleagues from 9 public agencies that are with me today. And this sharing extends beyond Singapore, to other countries. So we're particularly pleased to be hosting the next edition of BX in Singapore in 2017, and I certainly look forward to welcoming you all there. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Ping Soon. And yeah, we hope as many of you as possible will go to BX 2017, but in many respects it highlights a lot of these same principles, which is that you're trying to build a community of practitioners, not just in one country, but across the world. So I'm now going to just quickly introduce Elspeth. Elspeth is one of the Behavioural Insight team's original fire starters, in Ping Soon's words. She has done and laid the groundwork for a lot of the really interesting original studies that BIT did. She was involved in the work that we did on job centres. She led a program that I still think is one of the most interesting pieces of work that we've done around social workers, how they take decisions, why they take different decisions on different days of the week at different times. And then just before she came out to North America, she was the founding director of a centre that we created to look at adult skills and knowledge. And now Elspeth is based in our New York office, where she heads a program across US cities. So I'll just hand over to Elspeth.
Thank you. It's maybe a mistake. I didn't realise I was going to be attached. So I'm Elspeth Kirkman. I run our North American office, and it's pretty new. Started out last August. We've been trying to get our head down, mostly has been our strategy, and kind of get some good results. But I think the trajectory that Owen described absolutely applies. Kind of knew it in theory, and setting up a new office was an interesting way of kind of living it in practice, I suppose. So I think there were kind of three key things that fall into this getting buy-in section that were really helpful for us in the US. So the first is kind of the academic roots of a lot of this research are from the US, right? So academically, there's a huge kind of fantastic body of literature, but also a lot of great researchers who are always kind of open to discuss, really keen to work with us, and we have some great partnerships in that regard. And being that little bit closer has been extremely helpful. Backing from those really well respected in government. So our foundational kind of contract for the North American office is with Bloomberg Philanthropies. Some of you might have heard of Michael Bloomberg. He's quite a big deal, and is obviously incredibly well respected as both someone in business, but also really critically as a very kind of effective an effective politician, an effective government leader. So that's been kind of extremely helpful to be able to kind of plug into a network of organisations that are already kind of have cut their teeth and are very well respected in this area. And then finally, a really strong kind of precedent for applied projects. So starting out in North America, we weren't starting out, with a kind of blank slate in the same way that we were in British government, perhaps. There's a lot of organisations here that have already kind of laid a lot of the foundation work. The president, kind of came out and endorsed behavioural science and experimentation, and we're kind of standing on the shoulders of lots of great work already. So I think for me that's been a great experience in the North American office to kind of be able to take advantage of those things and actually make stuff happen. So thinking about what I mean by making stuff happen. So we signed up to basically completing 18 randomized control trials in about 9 months, about 12 months with city government across the US. So we've been working with 8 cities now, actually. We've actually done, I've been walking around telling people it was 21 randomized control trials, but apparently we've actually done 24. So apparently I can't count, which is a worrying kind of basic qualification, I think. And to pick these projects, it's pretty ambitious, and it's not normal, I don't think, to have to try and kind of crank out this many projects. And what we're trying to do here is to say, actually, what we're doing is trying as quickly as we can to prove that, yes, this stuff works in the UK, yes, it's worked for us elsewhere, yes, it's working at the federal level, and lots of other people are kind of making inroads at state level and at city level with perhaps bigger cities. But when we're working with kind of mid-sized cities with populations of 1 million people or less, then can we kind of get these things to work? So we're having to do that thing where we're picking the quick wins. And I use this kind of framework to think about what a good project might look like. So On the one axis, you've got how easy is it to do. This is highly scientific. You'll see from the fact it has no numbers on it whatsoever. How easy is it to do? So, do we have to invest a lot of time? Do we have to invest a lot of money? The effort? Are you burning political capital doing it? Is it kind of an infrastructure change, whatever? And then the second thing is, if it was successful, how impactful would it be? So this is kind of thinking about both your effect size, but also, from a sort of policy perspective, you might have a huge effect, but does it actually kind of move the needle on something? And the way I kind of characterize the 4 quadrants is, was described, I was showing this to an academic collaborator of ours, and he said that it's just the right amount of whimsy, which I think is going to be the title of my obituary when, when I die. So this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference, I guess, to that old Boston Consulting Group model of cash cows and dogs. So we have dead donkeys, which are very hard to do and 0 impact. So there's absolutely no point in you, trying to take on one of these projects. Avoid them like the plague. Then we have mules. So mules are kind of, they're everywhere. They're quite common. They're good, they get work done. But they're not going to kind of change the world anytime soon. We've got horses, so hard work, good work. This is a bit sanctioned framework, but it's my way of thinking about things. And then we have our dream projects. We have the unicorns. And unicorns, to be honest, usually turn out to be a horse with an ice cream cone on its head, which is worse than an actual horse. So if you think you found a unicorn, you probably haven't. So we kind of think about our projects in this way, and I think it's just a nice kind of neat way of summarizing how to pick a project. So some of our early projects I'll just talk about now, and I'll kind of overlay on this. So we've done a bunch of stuff around revenue collection. So, Owen already talked about the kind of classic 9 out of 10 people pay their tax trial. We've done some stuff in the US that's drawn on many of the insights that we've used in the UK, that we've used in Australia, that we've done in collaboration with our partners in the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore and various other organisations. And some of the results have been really good so far. So we just did a couple of sewer billing trials with cities, for example, that brought forward about $500,000 in payments, doing some cool things like handwriting on the envelope, led by my colleague Owen. Confusingly, we all have the same names. So that's been a really kind of good quick win. We've also more than doubled collection rates on parking fines, and people often ask about the kind of cross-cultural translation on this work. It's definitely true that in the UK, in the US, and apparently in Singapore, everyone gets a parking ticket, immediately decides they want to appeal and doesn't want to pay it. So we are all one in that regard. So get some good stuff on revenue collection, and I've kind of put this in the pretty impactful, pretty easy to do category. It is a bit of a dream area, and obviously it depends what you're spending the revenue on, but money for government's never going to be a bad thing and potentially can generate great impact. Next up, we've got demand shift stuff. So, this is more about helping governments to channel the demand so that they can use their limited resources to best effect, and they can kind of target help and assistance towards those that really need it. So David, in the initial session this morning, talked about some of the work we've been doing to shift people out of the DMV and to go online. No one wants to go to the DMV, no one likes it, but people still end up kind of doing it. And we just had this really successful trial, which in the city of Denver, where the result is that we're going to get about 9,000 drivers in the next year to renew their license plates online. And one thing I thought was really interesting about this is I presented it a while ago, and someone came up to me and said, "Oh, you know why I always go to the DMV to renew?" And I was like, "Oh, no, why?" And she was like, "Because I just always take a really bad photograph, and I get like one chance to have my photo retaken in the DMV." So I was like, "Okay, maybe we should think about online photographs as our next nudge." And we also got businesses to basically up their use of online tax filing by about 2/3. So big filing period in January, and we sent various different letters to businesses kind of emphasising the benefits or emphasising the losses of not filing their taxes online. And we found, interestingly, that the social norms message that told them that most other businesses in Denver were actually filing online was really effective. So again, something that works internationally. And then lastly, workforce development stuff. So basically helping governments to get in new staff, to get in more people, to get in a sufficient number of applicants, but also a more diverse range of applicants so that they can be more kind of representative of the populations they're seeking to serve. So we're in the middle of a piece of work at the moment with the city of San Jose, where we're looking at getting about a bunch of police candidates to basically reactivate their application. So they've gone through the process. It doesn't seem that they're ineligible necessarily. They've just kind of dropped out, and it's just kind of a prompting to get them to re-engage. And about 1 in 6 people seem to be re-engaging, looking at the interim cut of the data. We've also been using postcard ads to basically cold approach people in the city of Chattanooga to say, hey, would you like to become a police officer? So we have a data set that is people who are on the election register, so it looks like they're fairly kind of civically engaged individuals. My colleague Elspeth was talking about this in one of her sessions, I believe, but we've found that certain messages on these postcard ads are more effective, particularly ones that emphasise the idea of something being a challenge over the idea of something being, intrinsically kind of, or, inherently good, I suppose, for the world, which is kind of an interesting public service, flipping of the public service message or received wisdom. But actually, for particular groups of candidates, so there's a differential effect on African American applicants, for example, where we emphasise the kind of stability of policing as a career as well. So, really interesting in terms of diversity. So there's some early results. I'll talk about one more. And this is kind of, the percentages you'll notice are really low, but bear in mind when I'm talking about this that this is essentially a kind of social marketing campaign. So we worked with a not-for-profit and the City of New Orleans Health Department, and we basically sent text messages out to offer people who were living in severe poverty the option of going to a free doctor's appointment. And the qualifying criteria were severe poverty, but also not having visited a doctor for the last 2 years. So we know that it's not a group of people who are routinely engaging in healthcare appointments. And we sent a simple message that this is the response rate, so the number of people replying and saying, yes, I'll take up this free appointment. 1% response rate to a simple message that just said, do you want to take up this free doctor's appointment? So it's a pretty low baseline. We tried this ego message, where we basically said, you've been specially selected, and we've seen that this has worked really well in other settings, albeit with kind of very different groups. So we've done it on businesses, getting them to take up a government subsidy, for example. And we found that significantly different from the simple message, telling people they've been specially selected, goes up to 1.4%. And then we found that we tested this pro-social message. So again, this is the idea that we should appeal to people on the basis of some sort of pro-social motivation. So we said, visit the doctor so that you can look after the ones that you love. And this idea, everybody, we kind of always put our bets on which one we think is going to be best in advance. And unsurprisingly, I think a lot of people's intuition was that this idea would work the most effectively. And we actually found it was significantly worse than just sending the simple informational message. And that's something that we're kind of finding again and again, actually, in lots of different settings. So it's starting to become an interesting trend. The other thing about this that I quite like is that we went back and we took that best performing message, the ego message, and we used it as our new control the next time around. So we basically had a whole bunch of people who still hadn't responded, sending the messages again. We stratified on what they'd received the last time. We sent half of them you've been specially selected or you've been selected for a free appointment text, which was the best one from last time. And we sent half of them we saved you a free appointment worth $150 text. And the reason that we thought this was going to work is that in the UK, very different setting, but we actually looked at getting people to show up for appointments where people were missing appointments. And the kind of the most effective message was letting people know the value of the appointment. But we found that in the US, that didn't work. That's actually really bad compared to the old control. And I suspect it's just one of those interesting kind of differences between healthcare systems. I think in the UK, people don't think, because we've got nationalised health insurance, people don't think of health in terms of monetary value. Whereas in the US, it's not a surprise to anybody to know that a health appointment is actually worth something. And similarly in Australia, the cost-focused message did actually work and was effective. Okay, so now we're kind of trying to move into some new policy areas. So we've got a bunch of kind of live questions that we're working on at the moment with various clients. So, can we improve health in the criminal justice process? Can we reduce violence against children in refugee camps? Can we share information better to boost clinical outcomes for patients? Can we ensure that people remain happy and healthy in old age? we're working on all of these. I'm going to talk a little bit about the hepatitis work that we're doing because I think it's really interesting. It's one of these areas where much of the gap between hepatitis infection being eliminated and where we're currently at is actually down to behaviours. So, you know, a lot of the medication is already there, particularly for hepatitis C, and for hepatitis B, there's a vaccination. So this is kind of a little bit of an overwhelming slide, I think. But if we've got this big goal, which is to decrease morbidity and mortality from Hep B and Hep C infection, then what we're trying to do at the moment is to break that down into the sort of, I suppose it's kind of a theory of change. It's just saying if all of these things happened, then we would be able to reach that big goal. Now, how do we kind of incorporate behavioural insights, and how do we kind of tweak at all those small levels to add up to overall success? So we have a bunch of different actors at play, right? So we have our orange boxes, which are the infected population. So they've got to take preventative action, they've got to get tested, and they've got to get treated if they're actually infected. And underneath those, we have what we're thinking about as kind of micro behaviours. So trying to just get it down to that lowest level of, you know, what's the kind of opportunity to intervene? What's the sort of touch point? Who's kind of acting and doing what. Then we have health providers. So they have to take a bunch of actions like administering the proper diagnostic testing protocol, practicing infection control in health settings. We have non-clinical professionals. So these people range from kind of community advocacy groups all the way through to tattoo parlours and various other places that might be transmission risk sites. And then we have the people who actually work on this particular initiative. So we're looking at internal behaviour change within their organisation. And lastly, everybody else in the kind of policy space who, you know, has some kind of ability to be able to, I guess, make the access to healthcare commensurate to the burden of this particular disease. So we're looking at that, we're working on that, and hopefully, you know, this time next year in 2017, I'll be able to tell you about that time we cured hepatitis. And then lastly, this is kind of what we're doing, where we're trying to say, build our capability and support others to do the same. So we have this big target in the middle, which is just, let's be better than we were yesterday. I'm actually not being good at this particular moment because my time is up. But I'll kind of talk through this. I think we have some time for questions, so my apologies for eating into it. So we have kind of 4 factors to this. So there's humility, empiricism, and partnership. And for me, there's kind of 3 questions that we can ask ourselves to, and that we do routinely ask ourselves to think about that. So one is, you know, if my government counterparts say to themselves, what happens if I don't bother showing up for work? It's like, you know, a child's life could be at risk, or, you know, someone might die, or actually, you know, this really important process isn't going to get done. If I don't bother showing up to work, I kind of need to, you know, to make sure that my answer's never going to be as compelling as that. But what is it? You know, is there a good reason for us to kind of be getting out of bed? And if there isn't, then what can we do and how can we do it better to change that? What do we not know that our partners do know? The limits of our knowledge are certainly not the limits of knowledge. And basically every single project we go into with a particular skill set and a particular kind of focus, but we're really reliant on kind of fitting, you know, the jigsaw together with all the things that our partners are experts in. And what do we know that our partners don't? Because sometimes there are things, and we can kind of, you know, we can be helpful, and that's basically what we're there for. So just trying to understand that so we can be as efficient as possible. If we think about building our partners' capacity, there's 3 things we've been doing. So we've built a digital toolkit, which is in its sort of beta testing phase at the moment, which is basically how to run a randomized control trial step by step in a policy setting. We've been running lots of workshops, and we've been kind of coaching partners that we're working with using this 3-project model, where we run the first project in partnership with them. We jointly run the second project, and then the 3rd project we kind of, you know, take the stabilizing wheels off the bike and watch them fly, and then maybe kind of, you know, go and pick them up and wipe some bloody knees if necessary. Test, learn, adapt. So we're trying to build in kind of quicker ways of doing this. So one thing that we've been doing is more laboratory-based or online kind of concept testing experiments. So if we could spend 4 weeks doing a literature review, or we could do, you know, a mechanical Turk study much faster than that, then let's, you know, really kind of refine our hypothesis before we get into that literature, and kind of think about how we might do things better and, you know, flip some of our assumptions on their head. And then we also have this methodology internally called think groups, which is about, I won't kind of go into detail. If anyone's interested, you can ask, but it's a good way to kind of eliminate groupthink, essentially. And then understanding the context. This is like, if we don't do this, then we're never getting work again. So we immerse ourselves in the field, we seek feedback, and we kind of relentlessly try and find the energy to act on that feedback, which is always difficult but always rewarding. So I think this is you, Owen. Where next?
Thanks, Elspeth. Well, maybe a statement. So I'm going to quickly just tee up. I've got a mic. I'm going to quickly tee up a few areas that we thought it would be worth discussing, but we're basically in the sort of Q&A session now, and given that we started a little bit late and we're running a little bit over, so maybe we'll finish on time and we can have a conversation afterwards in the break. So we just thought there were a few sort of themes that would be worthy of further discussion. One of them is about mainstreaming behavioural science, something that's come through for all of the sessions, I think, at BX this year. The other is something that I think Ping Soon was particularly highlighting in his talk, which is about the links between behavioural insights and other fields, so design and data science. New areas like the stuff that BOT in the UK has started to think about around character skills, where we're starting to get some of our early results. And then the last thing, which I think is really interesting, is around whether we can start a program of international trials collaboration. So one thing that we would love to be able to do is to start running trials across different countries, looking at the same questions at the same time. So if anyone wants to start those conversations, then either ask a question about it or come and see me afterwards. But do we have any questions for any members of the panel? Yeah.
I've got a question which is specific to the UK context, but maybe the Singapore experience speaks to it as well.
Yeah.
In the Inside the Nudge Unit book, there's quite an emphasis put on communication, but at one point it said that, of course, there's much more to it than communication. But I'd be interested in the collaboration you've developed in the UK government with the Government Communication Service, because they weren't on your list of partner groups, but they must have been an important collaborator, I think.
Yeah.
And the question is how to build on that collaboration with communication groups, because a lot of what you talk about does involve communication.
Yeah.
So I wonder, when you look about links with other fields,
Right.
what about communication as well as
Yeah.
another field?
Are you in communications yourself, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think my personal take on this is that in the UK government context, communications experts have tended to see their roles, or been forced to see their roles, as the people who, after a policy has been designed and crafted and needs to be announced, do all of the stuff that involves getting the message out there.
Yeah,
which they're trying to change. And I think that actually a lot of the work that we've been doing can be really helpful in that context, to basically just say that if you are a communicator in a government context, your aim should be behavioural change as much as holding the press at bay. And I think if you start to reframe communication in that way, then you start to generate much more interesting opportunities for people in the field to think about what their roles are. So we do regularly have those kind of conversations. I don't think we're 100% of the way there, but we're certainly moving down that path.
Yeah, but they've gone in that direction in the UK. The Government
Yeah.
Communication Service says that they see their role as communicating to bring about behaviour.
Yeah, and in fact they've just produced a paper recently that explicitly draws on our East framework to think about how they might do communications differently in the future.
Yeah, I wonder if the Singapore experience fits with that.
I think absolutely. I think the communications part of the Singapore government, the problem with marketing, as we all know, is that I know that 50% of the budget is being wasted. I just don't know which half, right? So I think one of the units that we have in our Ministry of Communications and Information is indeed looking at that. But I suppose the challenge for many of the communications experts is that they intuitively understand some of these behavioral insights, but it's very difficult to try to measure some of the outcome as a result of that. Of course, you can measure in terms of changes in perception and all that, but those are not really hard numbers that you can work on. But they intuitively get it, and they're trying to apply some of these behavioral insights into it. But measuring it and running RCT out of some of these campaigns are not something that we look at. Yeah.
Yeah, I just see that as an area for future attention. But that's,
I think it's an important one.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah.
what efforts have you taken or maybe have planned for disseminating what you've learned about what works and what doesn't across behavioral insights teams across the world?
So internationally as well as domestically, or?
So, there's many people now in the business of trying to prompt behavior change in governments. Is there anything that's being done to try to communicate to those other groups with similar objectives? What has worked, what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so we, in the UK, we try to be as open and transparent as we can within the confines of our government work. Most of the time that means publishing the findings for the trials or the policy work that we undertake. So I am at the moment pulling together our annual update, which will cover the whole of the UK team's work, the whole of the North American team's work, work in Australia, some of our work in Singapore as well. As well as that, there's been a big push within the UK government that we've helped to support around creating so-called What Works institutions that collate the evidence in different policy areas and then disseminate their findings. And there are some really amazing exemplars in this area. Top of the list is probably the Education Endowment Foundation, which ranks all education findings by the quality of the research, so whether there are tens of RCTs in that area, or the evidence is less robust, and the effectiveness of the interventions as well.
One of the things I would add on that is that so we're really into sharing our information. Anybody else who wants to kind of collate examples, we'll always kind of provide them in whatever format and those kinds of things. But one of the things we've been thinking sort of fairly seriously about as we're building this body of research under the initiative that we're working on is, we're behavioural scientists, so we know that just giving people the information isn't sufficient to get it to stick and to get people to act on it. So actually, I would love to see more in the way of not just bringing things together, but actually experimenting around, what are the ways that you can get kind of you can get people to buy in, particularly in relation to problems like, the kind of people who digest and use research are sort of by definition going to be smart, curious people. And smart, curious people like to kind of invent their own kind of way of doing things because it gives them purpose and makes them excited. So are there sort of things we can do to, give everybody all the information they need, but they just have to arrange it in the right order to kind of, to kind of get there or something like that. And also allow for people to, build on and contribute to an existing knowledge base rather than just consume it because, particularly in a world where one of the criticisms of nudging or sort of smaller interventions is, well, everybody's going to become inured to it, then it would be really great to kind of see an evolving and quality assured research database, I suppose.
No, I think I'm all for sharing it. I think we just need somebody to come forward to take the lead. A lot of times, many of the things that we are doing are quite similar across many jurisdictions. As you can see from the sharing, it can cross-cultural. I do know of an effort in OECD that's trying to compile some of these, and I think for Singapore side, we've contributed our case studies. So they've created a certain template, so we're just populating it, and I'm just not very familiar with where's the status of that effort. Somebody from OECD is pulling that together, and we're contributing to that, and hopefully that body of knowledge will grow, and they will be able to create an international community of practice.
We'll have to grab Faisal, who's in a
Faisal,
parallel
that's
session
right.
at the moment,
That's right.
in the break. Renos, do you want to?
Sure. So actually, Faisal is next door talking about your question with some early insights about this pulling together of experiences. So I work at the World Bank, and so you can sign us up on the international trials.
Excellent.
So I had a couple of questions about, so most times a lot of our projects deal with kind of more complex issues, partly because, sophistication of digital access admin data is not as accessible to some of the countries we work. Not all of the cases, but I guess I had two related questions. One is, since you're the most advanced in terms of years, projects, trials, one question is about the sustainability of the effects and what are you learning from replicating, scaling up a lot of the the things that have worked, and do you need to adjust as you readdress some of the same issues, or how is that evolution? And I guess a related one is you're moving to the more complex, areas where more diagnostics need to be a bit more kind of carefully adapted, etc. Is that changing the diagnostics kind of approach to things? And in terms of, you can speak to the time length or depth or whatever you're changing in terms of how to go about it.
Okay, all right. Shall I do sustainability and then you can do diagnostics? So I think this question of how sustainable are the effects comes up time and again, and I think it's actually really quite an important one. I think what we have been finding is that in some areas like tax compliance, the same interventions in the same context the following year do have similar effects, but they're not on the same person. So if you were to bombard an individual with the same message, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, you are likely to see diminishing effects over time. In other areas, like I can see Michael Sanders at the back has done a lot of work on charitable giving that David spoke about this morning. And Michael found in some of his experiments that the same interventions don't have as strong an effect the following year to those same individuals, but those individuals can be used, as David explained earlier, as your next round of people who can encourage others to engage in the program. So it's partly about thinking about how you can evolve your strategies over time, but one important thing to note, I think, is that is just in relation to those situations in which you have kind of ongoing processes where you need somebody to engage and then re-engage. There are lots of programs that don't require that, automatically enrolling somebody into a pension plan. Or alternatively, some of the work that we've been doing, like the stuff I mentioned on job centres, where it's really about changing what might be considered to be more habitual behaviours rather than the one-off decisions that you're asking somebody to do repeatedly. Ping-Sin, do you want to talk about either of those questions?
I'll just add a comment that certainly many of these interventions that we do currently are really based on pretty simple kind of intervention, which is changing the letter. I mean, I mentioned the example of how with a change in the letter, we increase the take-up of that one-on-one to 32%, right? But actually, are we happy with 32%? Probably not. So actually, after you do something, I think we went to look at the data. Why is it that still only we thought that's the best letter you've ever imagined, right? So the team was actually keen to redo another letter and change. We said, probably not. Let's not just try another letter. Let's try to understand why they are not coming. And ultimately, we found that they are not taking up the service because the hours in which we are giving them to come are actually not right. So the right intervention is not to send another letter, but actually change the process so that we offer more booking slots at more convenient locations. But of course, to do that, we need to structurally change some of our back-end processes. So I mean, the point here is that I think a lot of time when we do behavioral insights, we tend to just go for the easy stuff, so to speak, just changing the letter. But there's only a limit in which you can achieve the outcome through changing the letter. Some of the back-end changes, you may have to look at it.
On the kind of, I'll take the second one first, but on the different and more diagnostic work, I think one of the great advantages that I've seen from the Behavioural Insights team having grown so much is that it's allowed us to really diversify the types of researchers and the types of research skills that we're bringing in. So we now have many more people who have very strong kind of ethnographic research backgrounds or qual backgrounds or other things that maybe potentially we're less well trained and less well known for originally. And then one thing I was going to say on the one thing we're grappling with at the moment on the kind of sustaining effects point is when you have a big problem like how do you reduce violence against children, and it's essentially a case of how do you change a social norm away from something that is quite prevalent, then the problem that you're trying to solve today to kind of solve a little bit of that problem, your best case scenario is that you're successful with that and then tomorrow's problem is a different one and you're not kind of trying to solve the whole thing in one go. So how do you make sure that you're building not just a one-off kind of intervention, but interventions and messaging and substitute behaviours, whatever it might be, that actually evolve over time so that you're able to kind of make more and more progress and not just stop when you get that kind of small change, which frankly, when you're talking about inverting a norm isn't going to be particularly powerful. So we're kind of working on something to do with that at the moment.
So we've just got a couple of minutes left. There are two more questions from practitioners. So maybe we'll take them both together. Paul, do you want to ask yours? And then.
So my question was really, you focused on sort of end user behaviour change at the moment. How much work are you involved in or thinking about in terms of organisational behaviour, influencing people within those organisations to do things differently?
And would you like to ask your question as well?
Yeah, I think it was more about the multidiscipline side of things. Ping and I have been talking about the issue around advanced analytics, but also understanding the motivation you need to do for your staff. It might be on call centres or do the engagement. And the third end was you need to have a subsequent consequence of not replying. So you might send your first letter or your nudge email, but if you do nothing after that, you don't actually take anyone ultimately to court for not doing something. They then over time become ineffective. So it's that sort of, the nudge is simple, but what's the policy environment that you're actually trying to solve, and then what are the multidiscipline tools you use?
Do you want to take that one? So I'll take the organisational behaviour question first, which is I think it's another really important area that we have explored for the past few years, but not as intensely as I think we will in the future. A few people have mentioned over the past couple of days, including Iris in her opening talk, about the work that we've been doing about recruitment processes. And there we're explicitly building tools and services that enable organisations to take decisions in different ways without having to spend weeks and weeks digesting the latest behavioural science literature. So I think there's huge potential for us to be talking maybe in a year's time about new platforms that draw on behavioural science to do things differently. The multidisciplinary side of things, I actually think the Singaporeans have taken this to a level that we haven't done in the UK yet. But that combination of data analytics, design thinking, behavioural insights, I mean, there is a nexus of different disciplines there that all can be combined to do, I think, really interesting, important work in the future.
I'll give a quick example, because since the time is up, right, how we are trying to bring it together, right? So the challenge here is, of course, how can we be more effective in conducting inspections, right? So what we do, of course, is to, first of all, use business analytics to develop a predictive model of which are the companies that are likely to have dangerous practices. So we use that, and we use a predictive model to because there's only so much inspection resources that we have. So we use data analytics, crunch the data, develop a model, and say, look, these are the 100 places that is likely to default or do something wrong. That's where we then send our inspectors. Now, when we send our inspectors there, can the actions that they do be done from a behavioral insights nudges? Of course. So then we will study what sort of actions that they're taking and try to use behavioral insights so that it is not the enforcement-oriented but more solution-oriented. So that's one example of how we're trying to bring the two disciplines together. Just a quick.
Great, well, we're out of time, but if people have more questions, then come and talk to us now. Thank you. We work with the Department for Energy and Climate Change at the moment at which they were changing the labelling for energy performance certificates, which every house that's being sold in the UK needs to display. These are the old certificates, very similar to the car labelling example that's been used a few times here. Almost impossible for anybody to understand. I remember when we were doing this work now, 4 or 5 years ago, asking that question, could anybody actually explain these labels to me in sort of lay person terms? And the answer seemed to be an emphatic no. They tell you that you can go from a 37 to a 73 on the energy efficiency rating front, but if you look at the environmental impact in terms of carbon dioxide, you could go from a 31 to a 69. So we changed it to this, which just tells you how much it will cost to heat and light your home over a 3-year period and how much you could save if you take 3 simple actions. So what are the kind of features of a quick win? Well, we think that, and just going back to my earlier point, that the purpose of the quick win is to be able to demonstrate in the early days of creating a unit that you can put something into practice relatively simply, that you can demonstrate an effect, and that will then take you on to more complex areas. And there are a few lessons, right? So you're already doing something. You're already sending out letters. You're already trying to collect your fines. The second is that you're already measuring the outcomes. You don't need to put in place lots of new complex outcome measures that you have to then create new monitoring systems to see whether or not they're likely to be effective. The third is that you can vary the interventions in some ways. If you're sending out 200,000 tax letters, the real question is, can you vary the way in which you do so? by changing some of the letters and not changing the others. And then ideally, you've also got a large sample of people as well. Are you talking about a system in which you're sending out 10 letters to 10 people across the country, or are you talking about a system where 200, 300,000 people are involved? And then the last lesson is that you get the results back reasonably quickly. Right? So for it to be a quick win, it's no good to be in a situation where you're saying, we'll put this in place, and in 3 years' time, we will get the results. But what these quick wins enables you to do is to build the case for those areas that are more complex and will take a lot more time. And it was only after 18 months or so that we started to move into some of these more So there are some overlaps between this session and the previous one on emerging units, but we hope that this will be a kind of practical guide to establishing some behavioural insight principles in practice in government at various different levels. This is partly as a result of the fact that there are now, as you all know, many nudge units, behavioural insight teams, behavioural insight units around the world. I compiled this chart of many of them. It's not comprehensive. So if you feel that you yourself are in a unit that is not on this list, come and see me afterwards and I'll add you on. We're going to go through 3 different case studies today. I'm going to talk about the United Kingdom. I'm the managing director of the Behavioural Insights team, so I'm going to tell you a bit about the sort of story that we went through a framework that I'll introduce in a couple of minutes' time. As you probably know, at the Behavioural Insights team, we love our frameworks, but you'll be pleased to know it's not a mnemonic, so don't worry about that. I'm then going to introduce Ping Soon, who's going to talk about Singapore, who have taken behavioural insights to a very advanced level across the Singaporean government. So Ping Soon is going to give us a couple of examples of some of the practical applications of behavioural insights in Singapore. And then I'm going to hand over to Elspeth Kirkman, who is the head of the Behavioural Insights team's North American office. And Elspeth works across US cities with a big program of work with Bloomberg Philanthropies. So you should be able to get lots of different insights from different layers of government. But all of them have gone through, we think, the same similar trajectory that we think that we can all learn from. And in some ways, it was the path that when we were creating the Behavioural Insights team back in 2010, we started to think about putting it into practice without really knowing whether or not it might work. And so there are 4 parts to this very, very simple framework. The first is all about getting buy-in from your partners. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we mean by partners and how it's not just about political support that's important there. The second, which is a theme that I think has come through many different sessions over the past couple of days, which is starting with the quick wins and why this is really, really important to being able to then move to more complex policy areas. And we think that sometimes this is almost the most complex area. So this is a job centre in Essex, in a place called Loughton. In fact, Elspeth herself did a lot of trips to this particular job centre. We were asked to work on this programme, which was around helping to get people back into work more quickly. It would have been, I think, for the Behavioural Insights team in its early days, fairly suicidal to start with this project, because you're talking about very, very complex interventions that will take many months, if not years, to reveal their results. But once you have a tranche of interesting findings, people will start to come to you and say, actually, I've got this problem that is quite complicated that you will need to invest more time and effort into putting into practice. So we spent time working in this particular job centre in order to design interventions, and a lot of them were exemplifiers of the kind of approach that we had then, by this point, started to detail. So it was all around simplification of processes, getting people to commit to future activities rather than dwelling upon what happened in the past. So we'd now run we turn this into a big trial to demonstrate the effectiveness of these kinds of interventions in a job searching context. And in fact, a lot of this work has also been demonstrated to be quite effective in Australia and Singapore. And there are lots of trials, including those that David talked about this morning, that show that once you've got some of your quick wins, you can start trialing things in much more complex environments. The other thing is that it started to create those quick wins demand in lots of interesting new areas that wouldn't necessarily be seen initially as sort of classic behavioural insight type interventions. So this is one of my favourite examples. We work with the Home Office and the Metropolitan Police, the police force for London, who are worried about the rates of mobile phone theft. 750,000 mobile phones get stolen every year in the UK. We realised that it was going to be quite difficult to influence consumer behaviour in this area. So we developed, borrowing from some work that had been done in the 1980s around car thefts, what we call this mobile phone theft ratio, which is using the data that the Metropolitan Police gather to construct these charts that show you which mobile phones in London are the most targeted. And we do that by looking at which phones really want to make something happen within a behavioural insight context. You need to find people who are operational leaders whose aim is to make things happen. And you can have all of the political support that you want, but without individuals on the ground who are willing to take things down a different path, it is very difficult to make anything happen. And my one bit of advice would be to say, find your Nick Downs wherever you are, whatever administration you're working in, because they're the people who will be able to create the next stage of things, which is the quick wins. And I'm going to describe in a minute what I mean by the kind of characteristics of these quick wins. But in what is now probably the most famous example of the behavioural insights team's work, which is being around tax compliance, it was really Nick Down in the tax administration, the tax authority in the UK, who spotted this initial opportunity. He'd read Robert Cialdini's work around social influence and was interested in how it could be applied in a UK government context. We spied that opportunity and we seconded people from our unit into the tax authority in order to work with Nick to start running these trials. And as you probably know, it's almost like I feel that this one example is now so often quoted, it's become a cliche that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. But if it wasn't for individuals like Nick, we would have never run these experiments. Similarly, we had developed some partnerships with people in the court service in the UK. And it kind of exemplified another aspect of our early approach, which is unless you really understand the operational side of practice, you won't be able to see where the opportunities are for putting in practice projects and running trials. And in this particular case, we noticed that there was a guy in the court service who was texting people who'd failed to pay their fines. And at the same time, when we went out with bailiffs, we noticed that people just weren't opening final reminder letters. So there was an opportunity to work within the operational side of the court service to run trials. And again, this is a sort of fairly famous early example of ours. We noticed that texting people, prompting them to pay their court fines on time, more than doubled the response rates, and personal messages that were aimed at an individual seemed to be even more effective. And similarly, I could tell this story about maybe 50 different areas. Important lesson that is often forgotten about, because behavioural insights has always been quite a new discipline. And if you're able to say, here is something that we can demonstrably say works, then you can start moving on to more complex areas. And then the fourth and final thing is the importance of building your capability. So building the capability of both your team, but also being quite open to working with others, to building partnerships and to helping others to develop their own capability. So that trajectory is the one that I'm going to talk through from a UK case study perspective. Ping-Soon's going to do something similar in relation to Singapore, and then Elspeth's going to do something very similar in relation to US cities. So case study number 1, the United Kingdom. So this first lesson is, it is almost impossible to get a team up and running if you don't have backing from the people that you need in order to get programs and projects in place. And I think in the UK context, there are some individuals that we almost always focus upon as part of this process. So the Prime Minister was obviously critical in helping to lay the foundations for the creation of the Behavioural Insights team back in 2010. But just as important were what we describe as the administrative support that is often not recognised. So these two people here, this is in the middle there is Lord Gus O'Donnell, who used to be the head of the UK Civil Service. He's now no longer a civil servant, but he continues as the chair of our academic advisory panel. And on the right-hand side is Sir Jeremy Hayward, who is the new head of the UK Civil Service. Both of those people, in addition to the Prime Minister, were very, very strong supporters of behavioural insight approaches as alternatives to a more regulatory-driven approach to getting stuff to happen in a UK government context. And they're kind of often forgotten about in the context of creating and sustaining a unit. But my real behavioural insight hero are not any of these three characters. They are people like this guy. This is Nick Down, who was the head of a unit in HMRC called Debt Management and Banking. And this person I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, but he is in many ways critical in the life cycle of the behavioural insight team. And it's partly as a result of the fact that if you really